It started as a dull pain in his stomach. Nothing serious, or so he thought. But as the hours passed, the pain grew unbearable. Sharp, stabbing, unrelenting. He could barely stand. Sweat poured down his face. His body was shutting down. He knew exactly what was happening. His appendix was about to burst. If it ruptured, infection would spread through his body and he would die within hours. There was only one problem. He was stranded in one of the most isolated places on Earth, a Soviet research base in Antarctica. No hospitals, no doctors, no rescue team. There was no one to save him. And so he made a decision that defies belief. If no one else could perform the surgery, he would have to do it himself. This is the unbelievable true story of Dr. Leonid Rogozov, who operated on his own body and survived. Who was Dr. Leonid Rogozov? Dr. Leonid Rogozov wasn't just any doctor. He was a highly trained Soviet surgeon. At just 27 years old, he had joined an elite team of scientists on a mission to Antarctica, helping establish a Soviet research base in one of the coldest, most unforgiving places on Earth. The mission was supposed to last for over a year. It was a chance to push human endurance to its limits, surviving in total isolation, cut off from civilization. But no one expected that the biggest challenge wouldn't come from the brutal Antarctic cold. It would come from inside his own body. For weeks, the team braved sub-zero temperatures, howling winds, and endless sheets of ice. There were no supply shipments, no communication with the outside world, just 12 men, trapped in the most remote place on Earth. And then, one day, it happened. A sudden, piercing pain in his abdomen. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe it was food poisoning. Maybe it would pass. But it didn't. The pain only got worse. Then, in the middle of the frozen wasteland, he realized the horrifying truth that his appendix was failing, and if he didn't remove it, he would die. The medical emergency. At first, Dr. Rogozov tried to ignore it. A stomachache was nothing unusual, especially in such extreme conditions, but as the hours passed, the pain became unbearable. Sharp, twisting, relentless. He broke into a cold sweat. His pulse was racing. He felt weak and dizzy. As a surgeon, he knew the symptoms all too well. It was appendicitis. His appendix was inflamed, and if it wasn't removed soon, it would rupture, flooding his body with deadly infection. In a normal hospital, this was a routine surgery, a quick, simple operation. But this wasn't a hospital. He was trapped in Antarctica, the most isolated place on Earth. There were no other doctors, no medical evacuation, no hope of a rescue team. A raging blizzard had cut off all contact with the outside world. He had only one option. He had to remove his own appendix. But how do you perform surgery on yourself without anesthesia? The impossible decision. Dr. Rogozov had no time to hesitate. If his appendix ruptured, it would flood his body with infection, and he would be dead within hours. He had no evacuation team, no antibiotics strong enough to save him, and no one who could perform the surgery for him. There was only one choice left. He had to cut himself open and remove his own appendix. But this wouldn't be like any normal surgery. The conditions were nearly impossible. First, there was no anesthesia. He would have to stay fully conscious, enduring every agonizing cut, every stitch, and every movement of the scalpel inside his own body. Then there was the issue of visibility. He couldn't bend forward far enough to see into his own abdomen, so he would have to use a mirror to guide his hands. And finally, the biggest risk. If he lost too much blood, or if the pain became too intense, he could pass out. If that happened, there would be no one to finish the surgery. No one to save him. Despite these dangers, Rogozov prepared for the procedure. He turned a small, dimly lit room into an operating theater, placing medical instruments within arm's reach. His assistants, a meteorologist and a driver, were given strict instructions. They weren't medical professionals, but they had to act as his surgical team. One would hold a mirror so he could see his own body, and the other would hand him instruments and wipe sweat from his forehead as he worked. If he lost consciousness, they were to do everything in their power to revive him. With everything in place, Rogozov laid back, took a deep breath, and made the first incision. The moment the blade cut into his skin, the pain was unbearable. His entire body tensed, his vision blurred, his breathing grew shallow. But he couldn't stop now. With slow, calculated movements, he pushed deeper, slicing through muscle, feeling the heat of his own blood spill across his hands. As he worked, he felt waves of nausea, dizziness, and near-fainting spells. At times, he had to pause, close his eyes, and gather the strength to keep going. His hands shook. His body was sweating, shivering, and exhausted. But deep inside, he knew. If he stopped, he would die. Then, after nearly an hour of excruciating pain, he finally found it, his appendix. But it was already on the verge of bursting. Would he be able to cut it out in time? The mirror made everything more difficult. His hands had to work in reverse, forcing him to fight against his own instincts. As he cut deeper, nausea overwhelmed him. His breathing became ragged, and for a brief moment, the room spun around him. He clenched his jaw, knowing that if he passed out now, there would be no one to finish the procedure. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward. Finally, after nearly an hour of excruciating pain, he found it. His appendix was swollen, dangerously close to bursting. There was no time to hesitate. With shaking fingers, he gripped the inflamed organ, tied it off, and carefully cut it free from his own body. For a moment, everything went silent. It was done. He had successfully removed his own appendix, something no other surgeon had ever done in such extreme conditions. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. With his strength fading, he now had to close the wound. His hands, slick with his own blood, struggled to hold the needle steady. Each stitch sent new waves of pain through his body, but he forced himself to stay awake, sewing his own flesh back together. The assistants, unable to do anything but watch, held their breath as he placed the final stitch. Then, as if the last thread had drained the final bit of energy from his body, Rogozov collapsed onto the table. Alive, but barely. The surgery was over, but the danger wasn't. Would his body recover, or had he just made things worse? A medical miracle. Dr. Rogozov lay motionless, his body drenched in sweat, his arms weak from exhaustion. The surgery was over, but the danger wasn't. He had successfully removed his appendix, but now came the hardest part, surviving the next 24 hours. His assistants helped him into bed, but there was no time to rest. If infection set in, all his effort would have been for nothing. He instructed them to monitor his pulse, check for fever, and administer the few antibiotics they had. But there were no guarantees. The first night was the worst. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. His stitches burned, his muscles ached, and exhaustion threatened to pull him under. But he refused to let himself slip away. Every few hours he forced himself to wake up, check his wound, and fight through the agony. Then, against all odds, the fever never came. The swelling went down. His body was weak, but healing. By the second day, he no longer needed assistance. By the fifth day, he removed his own stitches. And within 2 weeks, he was back on his feet, continuing his work at the research station, as if nothing had ever happened. His story became legendary. No surgeon had ever performed a major abdominal surgery on themselves and survived. When he returned to the Soviet Union, his name became a symbol of human resilience, medical skill, and sheer willpower. But here's the question. Could you have done what he did? Could you stay awake, cut into your own body, and fight through the pain, knowing that stopping meant certain death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.